Well, Sarabeth and Brian, welcome to AV Unplugged. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. Maybe just real quick, if you want to introduce yourself, Sarabeth, if you wouldn't mind getting started, and then Brian, just tell us a little bit about yourselves.
My name's Sarabeth Mullins. I'm a longtime member of AVIXA, actually. I'm a recent graduate of a PhD program where I was doing my doctoral research on the acoustics of Notre Dame, specifically looking at the acoustic history and the cultural heritage that was associated with the almost 900 years of human occupation at the building.
That's great. And did your dad also work for AVIXA? Is that right?
Yeah. He's been involved in the standards committee for quite a while. So
very good. Glad we've got family on the show today. That's great. Brian, go ahead. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Brian Katz. I'm an acoustician with the French Research Center CNRS at Sorbonne University. I've been here in France for about 25 years. And before that, I was in a couple acoustic consulting firms in the States. I was with Arab and Artec, mostly doing performing arts acoustics.
Well, thank you again for both of you joining the show. Let's start out. For those who have not been able to visit Notre Dame in Paris, could you describe it maybe from an acoustician's perspective? What is the sonic landscape there like? I think maybe, Brian, I'm assuming since you've been there for 25 years, you know the perspective of what it was like before the fire. Talk to me a little bit. When you visit, what does it sound like when you're inside that cathedral?
I would say the experience before the fire is kind of you get the sense of the volume. You get this sense also of the religious importance and kind of the awe. Something that I've always remarked is when you walk into a cathedral, you kind of instantly kind of talk quieter, and you hear kind of the general murmur that's at least in a visiting situation, not when you're in mass. And that kind of murmur in the reverb out in the distance really kind of gives a sense of a lot of cathedrals kind of have that kind of feeling. What makes Notre Dame kind of different than, I'd say, a large part of the cathedrals is its volume, its size, its height, in the general sense. And then you can get into some more specifics about specific architectural features that make it interesting, at least that make it different than other cathedrals. So kind of the triforium, which is kind of the balcony level, is deeper in Notre Dame than you see in a lot of other churches. The transept area, which is kind of at the altar, the cross piece, goes all the way through, and it's wide open, which kind of makes a separating volume between the altar side and the nave side. So there's a kind of acoustic characteristics to make it stand out a bit when you get a bit farther in the details.
Yeah. Sarabeth, did you have a chance to visit before the fire or no?
No, not before the fire.
Okay.
In fact, I was in Paris last week, and it was my first chance to really see the cathedral as she's supposed to be, rather than as she was in her bandages, so to speak, for the last 4 years.
Yeah. How did it feel walking in there for the first time and finally getting to hear, like you said, kind of the complete restoration?
It was a very overwhelming and special moment. I spent the last almost 4 years of my life sort of thinking, sleeping, living, every aspect of my life was sort of centered around, studying the acoustics of this place, as well as the culture and the people who worked and visited there. And to finally get the opportunity to see it myself was it was nice to see that it lived up to my expectations, and it lived up to the research that I had been doing myself. But on a sort of emotional level, it was also just very fulfilling to see it.
Absolutely.
All together.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, let's step back and rewind here a little bit, the story. Brian, you had worked on a project previously called the Ghost Orchestra Project, which was in Notre Dame. So talk us through, what was the idea behind that? Where did that get started? Because it does play in down the line here with the restoration as well.
So we were part of a French research project that was called Billy for binaural listening, which was really about how to get binaural audio techniques and technology out of the laboratory and into the mainstream. So there were a couple of research company partners, but there was also French radio, French television, the National Conservatory, and a couple of companies that made audiovisual products, renders and things like that. And the idea was trying to get the research out into the general public. And at one point, the conservatory was going to Notre Dame because there was a concert, and their choir, when they participate in the concert, they're also allowed to do recordings. And so they were going to record this huge performance. And we kind of thought it would be interesting to try and recreate that performance. It was for the 850th anniversary of Notre Dame. And we thought it would be interesting to kind of present a virtual version of that to people who couldn't attend the ceremony. And it kind of started with that idea. And originally it was going to be more of a PC version where you could navigate with a joystick. And at about that time was when YouTube 360 came out with its 3D audio support. So it could support first order ambisonics. And so then it kind of developed a bit further, and we said, well, let's make a real fly through in 360 on YouTube that anybody around the world can plug in and see. And the YouTube 360, if you haven't used it, uses the tracking either on the web browser, or it can take advantage of the tracking on your cell phone. You can use it in a head-mounted display or kind of Google Cardboard, which I think has disappeared from existence. But there was a time when, you could just clip on some lenses onto a cell phone and get kind of a head-mounted display experience. And so the idea is we were able to get in and record that. And then we were able to go in another day and do acoustic measurements. And from that, we built the 3D model, calibrated the acoustic model in cat acoustic according to the measurements, and then reconstructed the orchestra by putting all of the individual close mic tracks, each one with their directivity in the right place. And then we were able to do a fly through magic carpet ride around. And so that was the very first project that was very much an audio based project, and there was some graphics, but it was done mostly internally at the end of the project with whatever funds kind of remained.
Yeah. Well, and it's so cool too as well, because those clips are still on YouTube, and I remember Google Cardboard as well. So we'll include some of those links maybe in the description to this video so people can see. Sarabeth, talk to me a little bit about the acoustics of the building. A lot of people think this building's 900 years old. It must sound exactly the way it sounded back then, but things have changed, right, throughout that period of time, and that impacts the acoustics. So talk to me about how has that evolved throughout, the many centuries that this building has been around?
Yeah, I think you're really hitting on something important there when you say we think of these buildings as sort of static images. If I say picture a cathedral, picture Notre Dame, picture St. Patrick's, and any of these large, iconic worship spaces, 9 times out of 10, I'd be right in guessing that you're thinking of a building that is kind of white and all stone and has always looked the way that it looks in your mind's eye. But really this idea of historic conservation and building conservation is a relatively modern idea that really only started to develop in the mid part of the 19th century, partially at Notre Dame, in fact. But that's a tangent for maybe another conversation. Prior to the mid 19th century, churches and other large buildings like this were very much living buildings that were reinvented almost every generation. Like every time a new fashion change came through, a new art movement came through, the people who occupied the building would reform the building into the image of the times. So if we go back to the very earliest point that the cathedral was occupied, That's a much different building, even sort of architecturally than what we have today. It's about half as long. It ended before you even got to the transept that Brian mentioned a few minutes ago. It took them another 100 years of expansion to build the entire length of the cathedral. And you would think, oh, well, now once you have a complete cathedral, well, now it must have reached a point of architectural stasis. Only instead they turned around and they immediately began building a row of chapels around the outside of the cathedral in between the foundations of the flying buttresses. So from the first breaking of ground in 1163 until about 1350 or so, the cathedral was constantly under construction. And once they built the actual shell of the building, they really didn't stop there. We have these records from the church archives in the 13th century, the 14th century, the 15th century, where the number of fabrics that are held in the inventory of the church is increasing. And we know, this sort of fabric was reserved to decorate the church for Easter, and this one was for Pentecost. They had different sets of decorations that would come out for specific points of the church calendar. And as you start to get to the point where artists begin to depict the inside of the cathedral so that we can actually see a visual version of what was going on there, you see this sort of gradual ramping up of overall decorative levels. So by the time you reach the 14 and 1500s, for the big feasts, for the big important political experiences inside the church, you really aren't talking about a stone building anymore. You're talking about a stone building that's just been wrapped in thick textiles, that's filled with people. It's a very, very different acoustic experience. And when I was going through and sort of recreating these various states in the cathedral's history, you see a really strong impact on overall acoustic parameters such as reverberation time or overall speech and musical clarity inside the building. So essentially you have this story of like a cathedral that on the very important days when you really need to hear what's happening, you can really hear what's happening. And on the days where it's not an important festival day, you get that sort of sense of sacred awe that Brian was talking about earlier, where it's reverberant and sort of muddy and a very intangible experience. And honestly, I could continue blathering on about this for a while. But I think the one important thing that I will also note here is that throughout its entire history, the cathedral has not really had a single unified acoustic. So what we've found both in the measurements in the modern day as well as reflected in the modeling of the historic states is that there are multiple what you could call like acoustic subspaces inside the cathedral. So inside the choir stalls in the most consecrated area of the cathedral, we have reports from musicians in the modern day supported by acoustic measurements and modeling results that indicate that it's almost like performing in an entirely different church. And if you move out into the transept or you move out into the side aisles, basically every distinct place you could go in the cathedral begins to be defined more by the acoustics of the closest surrounding area of the church rather than the overall volume itself.
Yeah, that was so interesting. The New York Times did an interactive article that took you almost through the space, right? So there were different parts where you could hear this choir singing. And that was one of the things I think that was notable for me when you do it is that, like you're saying, if you're in the back, you have a completely different experience than being right there in those spots. So yeah, really fascinating to think about the way that it is a living, breathing building in one sense. It's not just this static image like you were saying. Interesting too, I feel like, did I read somewhere that at some point they maybe were trying to reduce the amount of reverberance and echo, and so they would change the flooring material as well? Is that right?
I don't know if it was intentionally for that, but there are times where there was carpeting and tapestries put in. The issue I think with the acoustics is there's very little record of people's thought process. The New York Times article is interesting because we supplied the audio for that and worked with them on getting that integrated. Really with the idea of showing this fact. Some of the comments that we do have that I think are interesting, if I backtrack a bit, are kind of this before the lateral chapels when the side walls are quite smooth. There's already kind of side altars all along in existence, and basically rich people paid the priests to give services and prayers for them at these side altars. And we have complaints on record from the main clergy that when they're trying to give a service, they're being bothered by the noise of all of these side services. And it's about then where they start creating these side chapels and basically pushing all the side walls out in between the flying buttress supports to make these little alcoves. We don't have a record that's why they did it, but we know that before they were complaining, and then after they said it wasn't so bad. So you can kind of think it gave them more space, but it also improved the acoustics.
Right. Wow. Yeah, such a fascinating history and such a long span of time too. I think of us, in the United States, we think 100, 200 years is a long time, but for many of these places in Europe, you're talking 900 years, for example. So yeah, really, really incredible. I want to turn now a little bit.
And then I had a discussion with a guy at the Museum of the Pyramid of Giza, who's kind of interested in an acoustic kind of a similar kind of acoustic history study. And he said, yeah, you guys in Notre Dame, that's 800 years. That's nothing.
One of those hold my beer moments.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like we had 800 years and nothing happened.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. The histories that you all are working on are very different than the type of histories that I've gotten to work on. So, yeah. Well, let's transition to talk a little bit. Obviously, there was the tragic fire. Talk to me a little bit. I would imagine, Brian, with you being in France for 25 years, were you in Paris at the time? How did you first hear about it? What was your initial reaction? Talk me through a little bit about that first day when you found out about the fire.
So I live about a 20-minute walk from the cathedral, and I was home working. And my wife was watching television, and it came on the news, and she said, "Oh, there's a fire at Notre Dame." And I kind of said, well, okay, fine. So there's, something little, and they made a little noise about it, and they're talking about it. So I kind of didn't pay attention, and then like half an hour goes by, an hour goes by, and then you start looking and seeing the pictures and the flames coming out, and kind of realize that this is something quite serious. So then we kind of went over to see what was happening, and just the mass of people that were around kind of Notre Dame watching. I think that was before the spire had fallen, so the flames were kind of quite at a major point. And what I remember the most striking thing was I've never been in a crowd of so many people and it be so quiet. Everybody was just kind of fixated on watching it, and there was a little murmuring or whispering among people, but in general, it was a pretty kind of gripping moment in that aspect. And then you can kind of compare that to, I think about 2 months after the fire in June is when we first got access to go in, to kind of survey the state of how it was, and to kind of plan if we could do some acoustic measurements. And I'd never been in a cathedral that was that was intensely quiet, because I think there were only 10 of us in the building at the time. And then kind of the imposition or the kind of the impact of there's no lights, because there was no electricity. All you get is some sun coming through the new holes in the roof that didn't used to be there. The intense smell of kind of all the burnt wood and the debris. They were still in the process of cleaning up even the most major elements of that. And that was a kind of the second really kind of memorable moment of being in there, in that state of the post-fire.
Yeah. Sarabeth, how about for you? I would imagine you were probably not in Paris at the time, but where were you when you first learned of this? And then maybe talk to us a little bit about when did you begin to get involved in the project after the fire?
Yeah, so I was across the world when it happened. I was just arriving for my job at an acoustic consulting firm in Seattle. And I've always been something of a news watcher. So just as I got in, I got a text alert that said Notre Dame is on fire. And also being someone who's always cared very deeply about old buildings and buildings with interesting acoustics. I got my interest in acoustics from visiting St. Paul's Basilica St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So these sorts of places already have a very precious place in my heart. So I arrived at work and basically didn't spend most of that day doing anything. It was just watching the live streams coming from Paris. And I remember feeling just devastated at the time and like looking for a donation link or some way that I could, financially contribute to the reconstruction of the building. And when I eventually found one that looked legit, I remember donating, $20 or $30 to the reconstruction and just feeling like incredibly sad that was going to be my only contribution to the reconstruction of a building that significant. And, a year goes by, I'm finishing a master's program. It's COVID now. I'm looking for what do I do now as a room acoustics person in a world where we're not building any rooms. And Brian has made a listing for a PhD candidate specifically to study the acoustics of the cathedral. And I saw that and I thought back to the day of the fire and I thought about how devastated I felt and was like, well, this wasn't exactly the plan, but now's my shot. I might as well see if I can contribute. And yeah, 4 years later, but I wouldn't say I've contributed much more than the $20 to $30, but I feel like I have in some way participated in the reconstruction of something much, much bigger than any one of our lifespans.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, just from sitting here, I can tell you absolutely have much more than anything I've contributed. So you're definitely heading in the right direction there. Brian, tell me, how did you all first get involved then with the reconstruction? Because obviously you've got some, going back to the project before, you've got some data and things to work with that could be useful. Talk to me about how did that begin after the fire?
So quite soon after the fire, within days, I got a message from some colleagues saying, do you still have those measurements that you made? Those could be kind of important. And then so I started kind of asking around and seeing what other measurements there were and realizing that there weren't any. And that kind of put us in an interesting position. There was starting to be a couple kind of scientific volunteer associations about how you could contribute. This was quite early on, so I think there was probably 4 or 5 at the time. And I was kind of putting my name on a list saying, well, I'm an acoustician, I have some data and my office is close by if anything's happening. And then it was a couple months after that the CNRS, so the National kind of Research Foundation, and the Minister of Culture got together and decided to build what they call the kind of the scientific working group of Notre Dame, which was kind of bringing scientists from all around the country and even outside of France to offer their services and knowledge at the service of the reconstruction committee. And myself, along with Milen Pardoen, who's kind of a specialist in historical soundscapes. We'd never worked together, but we talked about working together. And she'd already done some work on, I think, 15th or 17th century Paris soundscapes and reconstructing them virtually. And we decided, well, let's get together and kind of propose ourselves to head the acoustic working group. So that was one way of getting directly involved with that, because we both work for the CNRS. And then in parallel, we kind of said, well, if we want to learn more, we need more funding. And so I kind of started putting together a research proposal, kind of a 4-year, 3.5-year kind of plan, bringing a lot of interdisciplinary efforts to basically really make this kind of the sonic history, past and future around Notre Dame, with sociologists and musicologists and architectural historians and art historians, and tried to build this big project, which got funded. And basically that's what let us really put as much effort into this archaeoacoustics project that I think probably more than any other building, because of the success of that project, a parallel kind of European version one, looking at kind of questions around archaeoacoustics and reconstruction. The working group also financed the PhD, which is what financed Sarabeth. So in terms of human resources and effort, we had quite a strong interdisciplinary team to attack this project.
Yeah. That's fantastic that you were able to move that quickly too. I mean, and to be able to find those resources as well. Well, where did you all begin then? Obviously, you've got the funding now, you've got the personnel in place, but I came across a YouTube video of, it looked like driving a robot through the cathedral, because I think maybe the cathedral was unsafe. What were some of the activities that you all had to do to get started with your research?
So the big funding for the project didn't kick in. I mean, that was about a year later, which is when we were able to hire Sarabeth and bring her in. Up until then, we were kind of working on overhead at the lab and just volunteer work. But we were able to actually get on site to do measurements. I think one of the first teams, I think we were maybe second or third team to really get in and have access that way. And because of the structural integrity of the vaults that was damaged when the spire fell through, you weren't allowed to go into any of the areas that were basically directly under the ceiling. You could only stay under the triforium areas where there was basically another level of the building to protect you. But what we wanted was the measurements down the middle to kind of, for the normal things. So we kind of tossed around a bunch of different ways to do that, and came up with the idea of a robot, or I don't know about a remote controlled device, and then kind of started putting together a set of equipment and tripods on wheels, and all equipped with microphones, and then tripods tied to each other. So there was a string of them going down, and then we had to find a way to pull them. And looking at a bunch of remote controlled devices, the only one that we found that was strong enough to pull it and wasn't gas powered, because there were some that were basically, they had remote control tractors that were moving around and brushing everything. But if we were going to use that, we'd have to start the engine and stop the engine every 2 meters. But we found a company that made sewer piping inspection robots that had enough traction to be able to drive through debris and pull things loose. And basically, we hired one of those for a day and tied all the equipment to it. And that's basically what pulled the microphones kind of all the way down the center of Notre Dame. The speaker, I think we basically just tied some string and a tennis ball to both ends and threw it across so that we could pull it left and right depending on where we wanted it. But that was the the first measurements that we were able to do. And then after that, I think the subsequent ones, I think we've done 2 or 3 more measurements that Sarabeth came for on kind of the evolution of the reconstruction. So at least we have some documentation, but due to all the work and scaffolding, I mean, we were there at one point and you couldn't see the building through the scaffolding. There was so much. They're interesting historically, but they don't really tell you much about the acoustics of the building.
Right.
And now we're in discussion about trying to get in the next 2 or 3 weeks to finally do post restoration, because the last time we were there, we were in end of September.
End of September, yeah.
Thinking, oh, they're almost done because it's going to open in a few months. And no, they were still like sawing and cutting and jackhammering, and as well as pulling fiber optic cables and things like that.
Yeah. We've got some great recordings from a couple of the microphones in the cathedral that we placed in September, where you can actually hear some of the workers on site mimicking the sound of our sign sweeps, which you really, you have to appreciate their enthusiasm, but it does corrupt the data a little bit.
Oh, that's great.
I actually remember my very first day as a PhD candidate was to go into the cathedral for a set of measurements. And there was this, very strong rush. I was, of course, handling all of this immigration process. And Brian said, basically you have to be in Paris for January 4th. They have told us that this is the day they are finished with the cleanup. And it's like the one transitional day between when there's rubble and when they're going to start putting up scaffolding. And well, as it turned out, this would be the start of a very long trend. After pushing and rushing to get to Paris to be there on January 4th, we go into the cathedral, and of course, there's already scaffolding up. So for the last 4 years, we've sort of been negotiating this balance of trying to get these acoustic measurements for sort of historic documentation purposes, archival purposes, while also never knowing what the actual state of the cathedral will be the day that we are planning to go in and make those measurements.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a huge balance that took place there between, obviously they were under a tremendous amount of pressure too, because I think Macron had announced a date pretty early in the process in terms of the cathedral will be ready by this time. So yeah, I'm sure there was a whole lot going on there. Yeah.
And I mean, what's important to remember is when that was announced, that was before COVID.
Yeah. Right.
So you had the fire. Oh yeah, sure. We can fix that. Then you had the issues of the lead contamination and the possible, all the hygiene that was related to that, which limited how many people could be on site. It limited how long you could be on site. And then just when you think it's getting ready, all of a sudden it was like, well, lockdown. Now you can't go in at all. I mean, the first time I went in, I had an electric respirator, as well as the full kind of, not hazmat, but kind of one down from hazmat, and you could be in there for 2 hours, and that was it. And then you had to come out through decontamination, rest before you were allowed in again. So, I mean, things were really working in very small bits, which is kind of how we ended up having such a limited access, because they basically said, say you can have 100 workers at one time. If we come in and say we want to do science, that means there's 5 workers that can't be in there. So there's a lot of negotiating, and basically there was a slot for scientists. And so now you're negotiating between, the wood specialists are coming, and the stone specialists and the metal specialists. And, and all you get is this little window, to kind of sneak in.
Yeah.
So there was basically people working there, I think 24/7.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And the fact that they opened it with only, I think, a 6-month delay compared to what the initial prospect was is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you would have liked to have a little bit more time in there, but 6 months is still pretty good. Yeah. Talk to me. So, as someone who is not an acoustician myself, Sarabeth, if you could maybe describe when you do go in to get measurements, for example, what are you measuring? How is that data useful? How are you using it then in the 3D modeling that you're creating? Talk me through a little bit just of how the process works when you are going in to collect this data.
Right. So at the end of the day, it's whatever group of us is going in. So hopefully 5 people, but we've managed with fewer, maybe not quite so pleasant. But whatever group of us that's going in, and a very large collection of microphone stands, microphones, video cameras, and omnidirectional loudspeakers. And the basic idea is we are trying to create a grid across the entire occupied regions of the cathedral. So both on the ground floor as well as on that triforium layer that Brian mentioned. Although, of course, it is a bit difficult to lug some of that equipment up there. So generally our second level, our triforium level measurements are a bit sparser. But the idea is over the course of however much time we have, we want to use that loudspeaker and create an impulse of basically a trace of the sound as it moves from the loudspeaker where we've placed it to a variety of microphones scattered across the area. And what that does is it gives us an awful lot of spatial information and a lot of energetic information as well. If you think about it conceptually, if you had a microphone and a loudspeaker out in the open air, and you were to create an impulse of the sound traveling from the speaker to the microphone, you're going to get like that initial burst of sound, and then you might get a bit of a reflection off the ground, but that's it. There's no further information that's returning to the microphone in this particular setup. Now, if you were to mentally place that setup next to a wall, things start to become a bit more interesting when you look at the time trace of the sound. Because now you have the direct sound coming from the loudspeaker, that first reflection coming off of the ground, and then at some point, determined by the configuration's location close to the wall, you start to see another reflection show up from that wall. And this property, this concept is really useful when you're trying to understand the way that sound moves through a complex space like a cathedral. Because in a cathedral, you have areas where the walls are very close together. You have areas where it's almost the same thing as a wide open space. And by recording the room impulse responses at a variety of locations within the cathedral, you get information about, number one, the spatial arrangement of the walls and the pillars and everything inside the cathedral. But those things all impact the perceptual experience of the acoustics as well. Now, if you were to think about the difference between singing in your shower versus singing in a parking garage, you will notice a difference between these sorts of things. So by going in and creating this grid and making as many measurements as we can across the full space, what that allows us to do is to capture the objective metrics. So things like the way the energy is sustained or lost in the cathedral or in certain parts of the cathedral. But it also gives us an idea of what the human experience of those acoustic parameters are. So for each of these locations, each of these impulses, we're looking at things like reverberation time. We're looking at things like the center time, which is the balance of early and late energy within the impulse. All of these things help us document, but they also help us to understand the acoustics of the cathedral in a sort of human scale and human perspective.
That's great. Brian, how then was the data used? I know that we had talked a little bit before this just about the reconstruction itself, and then there was going to be maybe some back and forth at the beginning of what type of restoration. Would it just be the way it was before? How was the data end up? How was it used at the end of the day?
So the first use of it is on kind of comparing it with that 2015 pre-fire model, where now when we have measurements in the cathedral that now has holes in the ceiling, we can actually make those modifications to the computer model and kind of update properties so that it matches. So it gives us more, another data point in kind of the sequence of how things are evolving. And in theory, we can keep doing that with each measurement and get a more and more refined. We kind of didn't do that so much, mostly because we'd end up modeling a lot of scaffolding. And in the end, it's all going to go away anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So we were kind of doing measurements for posterity while there was scaffolding, kind of waiting for that moment when there was no scaffolding, which now has finally happened, to kind of finish the loop of before the fire, after the fire. And those measurements will kind of help us compare and see how similar it is and in what ways is it dissimilar. We're expecting it to be dissimilar, but it kind of helps us quantify it. And if the cathedral is interested in trying to bring the acoustics now back to what it was then, we can provide advice on what possible changes they could make. So kind of the role of the acoustic consultant is kind of, it's hard to get away from, even, I haven't done that for 25 years, but there's still a bit of, in there to kind of wanting to give advice. And I think Sarabeth would be very happy to give, some consulting advice too. So we're kind of at the service of the cathedral to help them in that way. And in the same way, having that calibrated model still let us do some predictions. And the biggest was the choir organ. While the grand organ was really not destroyed at all by the fire, it was basically just covered in lead dust and had to be cleaned. There was no other actual damage to it. The choir organ, which is quite near the transept, which is quite near where the spire fell, got really inundated from the water when they were putting out the fire, and was kind of damaged beyond repair. And also it wasn't historically classified. And they had already been looking at making it bigger before the fire happened, to expand the range with more modern musical repertoire, to kind of boost the power of it, because it's a small organ, and also to change kind of the orientation of it, because at the moment it was kind of projecting across the cathedral at one end, and that was fine historically when the people who you care about are the clergy and everybody else is kind of an afterthought. But in kind of modern day times, it's all the general public that you want to kind of share the music with. So they wanted to kind of better project the sound into the general nave area. So they had a number of proposals from organ builders on how to solve that problem. And we were kind of tasked with at least doing an acoustic evaluation of the different proposals relative to what they wanted out of it. And that was kind of a perfect use of that computer model to say, well, we can put it here, we can put it here, we can move it up, we can move it down, and actually get a mapping of how the acoustics varies between each one of them. And then give that to the decision committee of how they choose which one they want to do.
Yeah. It's really fascinating too, just to think about the ways that, again, you went into, the Ghost Orchestra project, 2015, 2013, somewhere in there. And, you're thinking about using it for this one thing, then the fire happens and you've got this other thing that you can use it for. But now there's another thing that you're going to be using it for as a part of a film called Vaulted Harmonies. Brian, you want to talk to us a little bit about how that came to be and where, how people are going to be able to check that out in the future?
Sure. So when we kind of put together this research project on the history, the acoustic history of Notre Dame, kind of typically when we do these research projects, the main goal are scientific publications. And we try and share it with as many people as we can that way. And there was kind of this reflection, also somewhat inspired by the Ghost Orchestra, that was kind of a neat adventure in, I'd say, kind of public outreach and sharing things with the public. And due to the importance of Notre Dame kind of nationally and internationally, we thought, well, we should really make a big effort to share what we get out of this research. So there was a sizable kind of portion of the budget we allocated to public outreach. So after the very first year, we did kind of a web radio broadcast of the same music from the Ghost Orchestra, which was only 5 minutes and actually had a whole hour-long concert, and you can go online and you can pick what seat you want to listen to. And then a year after that, we worked on a radio fiction kind of podcast. And the idea was, in the midst of this kind of fiction story, we could slip in mentions of things that were related to the acoustics, and then always have kind of a little footnote saying, if you want to know more, look at this article. And so that ended up being Looking for Notre Dame. It's on Audible. It's for free. And it's like an hour podcast on Victor Hugo having writer's block and being transported around by kind of the spirit of Notre Dame into its history. And then a year after that, we decided to do an audio guide, like a museum guide of Notre Dame, for people who wanted to come and see Notre Dame but couldn't get in because of it's under it's all under construction. So it was a GPS guide where you could walk around the outside and hear the acoustic history of the inside. And so that's Notre Dame Whispers, and that's free on iPhone and Android. And you don't even need a GPS. You can listen to it at home. So that was out last summer. And now we're kind of nearing the end of the project, and we wanted to do something that really focused on the musical evolution. So since the conservatory is one of the partners, the idea was to basically take a number of musical pieces through history, and reconstruct each one in the appropriate acoustics of the time. And so now we have this virtual concert, which is called Vaulted Harmonies, an archeo concert. It has 11 pieces of music spanning over 7 centuries. And each one is in the acoustic model of the time. And then since it lasts an hour, there's a whole work on graphics to do kind of a reasonably realistic graphic rendering of what the cathedral looks like and how it changes, especially with the decorations. So there's like Napoleon's coronation, which we have records of, any exposed surface is covered in velour, and there's carpeting, and, he basically changed the look of the columns to make them square instead of round because he thought that was better. I don't know.
Built a triumphal arch in the nave.
Yeah, but we don't talk about that because we didn't build that. So it was kind of, let's do that. And, so there's 11 pieces, and each one has about a minute documentary style explanation of either architectural importance or musicological importance or political importance, like the crowning of Notre Dame, or we have the French Revolution, which kind of really changed what the cathedral was being used for at the time. It was a storage depot for wine, right? And then it became barracks. It was totally deconsecrated. And so you have kind of the fall part of the rise and fall of Notre Dame. And the idea was to get all of that into this film. And it was originally kind of meant we were going to do it as basically a YouTube film so that anybody could see it, and ended up talking to, there's a yearly festival called the Week of Sound, which is a UNESCO supported festival. And it's based here, at least the main office here is in France. And they thought that the project was interesting enough that they were willing to kind of organize a projection of the film in a movie theater, and were able to secure a Dolby Atmos top of the line movie theater, which then made us go, oh, we have to do some more work now. And so we're at the final stages of that, and that's being shown there at this theater next Friday. And then probably in the couple of weeks after that, we'll start figuring out how to put it online as a binaural version, even a downloadable version in probably 5.1 and 7.1, trying to contact museums in France and even around the world, who want to show it that way. And then we're even looking at, since the audio is all mixed in 3-dimensional sound in ambisonics, and the image is all computer graphics, we said, well, you could also do a 3D, like a 360 version. So now we're looking at making a shortened version that can be played in planetariums. And we're looking at that for the springtime, and that should be freely available through the planetarium distribution network once that comes out. And in the same way, we can also do kind of a head-mounted display VR version. And the idea is to have a shortened version of that will be free on the Quest store. Can't remember which one, where you can actually choose where you want to sit for a number of the pieces. So the idea is to try and get as much as we can, to share as much as we can with people.
It's so cool. And Sarabeth, I would think for you, like Brian mentioned, a lot of this research sometimes, goes into a paper or something, but it's not broadly used. I mean, this got to be pretty rewarding, I would think, for you as well to, virtual reality videos, New York Times articles. It's got to be pretty cool to see your research kind of out there and being appreciated by so many people.
Yeah, I mean, you spend so much time sort of hyperfixating on the details and thinking like, oh, I could make this a little bit more perfect in this way, or oh, I need to find 4 more sources to support this one thing. And I think sometimes it's been quite easy for me to lose track of maybe the larger interest and impact that the work that I've been doing with Brian really does have. So yeah, I'm very excited to see this film come out, simply because I would love more people to sort of be able to experience the things that we've been studying in our experiments at the lab, that we've been, really taking like this data heavy focused approach to. I'm excited to see it shared in a way that's a bit more digestible for the rest of the world. We're publicly funded researchers, so it's great to be able to give back to the public the fruits of our labor.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and to think about too that we now have technologies like spatial audio and things like that, where you can be thousands of miles away, but you can, obviously it's not going to be the same as being there in person, but you can get pretty close, right? So really, really cool that we are utilizing these technologies. Like Brian, you had mentioned, you were an acoustic consultant 25 years ago or whatever. We didn't have these kind of tools back then, right? So to be able to leverage these technologies. Yeah. Yep. Yeah,
and I was trying to do it then, and I'm doing the same thing now, just with more computers behind me.
That's great.
I mean, I think what makes it interesting is, so kind of what we did with the film is basically utilizing a bunch of techniques and technologies that we developed with Sarabeth for her experiment. Whereas the film is kind of this offline post-processing. Sarabeth really worked on an experiment of looking at how acoustics affects performance. And with this question of, you kind of have singing styles that are evolving at the same time that the architecture of Notre Dame is changing. And are certain singing styles better suited to certain versions of Notre Dame's architecture? So the work was basically to make a real-time simulator for a choir who could sing as if they were in any of those kind of historic situations, but still be able to sing naturally without any kind of hindrances of the technology. So no latency, no artifacts. And all of the tools that we made for that, then when you use them easily or kind of simplify them, can actually be moved into like a production quality plugins in workstations and mixing boards. And that's what was used then to make the audio guide and to make the radio fiction and to make the virtual concert.
It's incredible. Yeah, it really is. Brian, one last question before we wrap up here. We heard from Sarabeth in terms of her first impressions being back inside the new cathedral. But for you, when you walked in, your first time being in once the space was complete, talk to me a little bit about how did it feel? What were some of the emotions that you were experiencing that first time?
I mean, it's visually so impressive. I mean, it's the level of restoration of all the paintwork and the fresco kind of aspects, the level of detail. There's kind of an added highlighting detail, a little red line that kind of follows all of the molding and a lot of the archwork. Just this one little fine red line that, if I understand, was actually something proposed by Viaduct when he restored the cathedral. I don't know, about 130 years ago. And so there was a kind of a choice to kind of honor that, and the cleanliness of it is amazing. So basically, because of the lead contamination, they had to deep clean every square inch of the stone. And to do that, basically, I think the solution that they ended up using was basically spraying it with latex, waiting for it to dry, and then pulling it off. And that pulled out every grain of dust, even in the little pores. I think I saw one article talking about they actually discovered some graffiti that they couldn't see on the stone, but when they pulled off the latex, it was on the latex. And now they have that framed in one of the offices. So what that meant is basically it is now a brand new Gothic cathedral. And kind of that starkness of, is it old? Is it new? I mean, a lot of the paintings and the decorations in the chapels are basically as if they had just been done. A lot of them are from more like Viaduct's restoration, but basically you're seeing it the day after he opened it, and it doesn't smell. I mean, there's no smell of paint, but other than that, it's that. So there's kind of that really kind of stark difference. I mean, one of the things it wasn't until the second time that I went that I realized. I mean, when you go to a lot of kind of European cathedrals, it's like going to an old library. There's a smell of, books, of old books. And cathedrals have the same thing, from the dust and the wicker chairs and X centuries of incense burning. And Notre Dame doesn't have that. You walk in and there's this lack of olfactory history. And it's kind of interesting. So at the moment, I've only been there when it was totally packed. It was in the first week. So I'm really looking forward to being able to go in the next couple of weeks to do a measurement and kind of have the conditions that we had in the beginning to do a better comparison. Because since there's really no absorption in the cathedral, naturally, when you bring in, 2,000 people, they are the main absorbers, and they will have a strong effect on kind of reducing the reverberation in the space. But there have been comments already by the organist saying, it's more reverberant than it was before, and the organ doesn't sound the same as it did before, which is kind of expected, like in a new building. So like in a lot of new concert halls, when you open a new concert hall, the resident orchestra needs time to adapt to this new instrument and kind of retune and readjust to its responsiveness. And the organist and the choir are basically in that same situation of, it's the same, but it's not the same. And so there's a bit of adaptability on both to do now. Yeah.
Well, let's hope that when you do eventually get in there to take those next measurements, they don't put up scaffolding and just surprise you out of the blue. Okay?
It would be really funny if they did that.
It would be quite the sense of humor. Yep.
I mean, there was one time we went because they said, "Yep, the scaffolding's gone," and we go and they're putting it up. We went back another time And they're saying we were basically going up to do an inspection, and while we're climbing up the scaffolding, they are taking it down above our heads. Like, you're climbing up and there are pieces of it coming down on chains. And then they're rebuilding it like 20 meters away because they need it over there.
Wow.
It's just a crazy kind of construction site in flux all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure this has been the project of a lifetime for you both to work on. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes just to talk to us about it. I personally cannot wait to visit. Fingers crossed that I can get in the line and get through in time. But yeah, thank you both just for your work on this, your willingness to talk us through and share your experiences. And again, all the best in the future. And thank you. And we will definitely be sure to include links to everything that we've discussed in terms of like different articles, the Vaulted Harmonies series as well. Definitely want to encourage people to go out and watch it in person. And if they can't make it in person, go online as well. So Sarabeth, Brian, thank you both for the time. Really appreciate it, and all the best.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.